The way modern culture talks about happiness is fascinating, to say the least. It often seems as though the goal is to make life as easy and effortless and certain as humanly possible. Yet the moment that ease arrives, with it a deep sense of heaviness and existential dread settles deep into the soul. It's like an internal alarm system goes off. It shouldn't be this easy. There must be a catch. And a catch there is indeed, because Danish thinker Søren Kierkegaard warns of what lurks beneath the tranquil waters of surface happiness and immediate satisfactions. His probing insights of the human psyche are clever, bitingly ironic, and equally eye-opening and disturbing. In this video, I want to explore the condition that Kierkegaard believed plagues us all, and the dangers that threaten to consume our happiness when we almost certainly fail to notice it. Most people live their lives immersed in chasing goals, achievements, and doing what society expects of them. They live what seems to be on the surface a perfectly happy, balanced life. Yet deep down, there is this vague sense that our happiness is borrowed, that at any moment tragedy will befall us. So we try to preempt it by seeking tragedy ourselves to gain a false sense of control. Tragedy cannot come unannounced. It shall come on my terms only. But to our sharp, relentlessly original thinker Kierkegaard, there is something deeply suspicious about simple pleasures and immediacy. He thought that what seemed to be a perfectly happy and balanced life to the outsider is, in fact, merely a life infested with despair, most certainly unbeknownst to its inhabitant. To understand this, we first need to understand how Kierkegaard saw the human self. What is the self? In his book, Sickness Unto Death, he embarks on a profound diagnosis of the human condition and the fleeting nature of comfort when not grounded in a true recognition of the nature of the self. He challenges us as to whether we truly know ourselves and argues that most of us don't even recognize that we have a self to begin with, let alone live our life in such a way that allows that self to actually exist as it is meant to be. What I will present here in this video are distilled insights that represent my own understanding of this beautifully complex layered work. They are by no means complete, nor even necessarily true. Especially Kierkegaard thought that truth is something that needs to be realized inwardly and cannot be taught. So I do encourage you to delve into this poetic piece yourself and let it unlock doors in your understanding specific to you. But what exactly is the self that so few of us ever get to meet? Kierkegaard gives a definition that sounds almost cryptic. The self is a relation which relates itself to its own self. What he means is that the human being is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process of self-synthesis. Because we are conscious and we can self-reflect, we can stand outside ourselves, asking who we are, who we should become, judging, questioning. No animal is capable of doing this. An animal simply is. It doesn't step outside itself to see itself, to measure what it is against what it could be. Because of this capacity for self-reflection, the self is in a lifelong making process, continuous iterative refinement, if you will. According to Kierkegaard, it must continually become itself. We are not birthed finished products, nor do we reach that stage upon adulthood or even in old age. And for the self to be made or synthesized, it needs to integrate the opposites that compose it. Kierkegaard thought that we are creatures of contradiction, holding completely opposites within us. We are both finite and infinite, tied to our decaying bodies, limited time and circumstance, yet capable of imagining beyond all limits. We are bound by necessity or what already is, yet open to possibility, free to choose what could be. Our task, which is also our deepest struggle, is to be able to embrace those contradictions without losing balance, for only then we are capable of becoming a self. Without it, we succumb to despair. The structure of despair, finitude and infinitude. According to Kierkegaard, most of us don't manage to integrate these opposing aspects of ourselves and end up tipping into one direction or the other, often without even realizing it. We see it everywhere around us. The person who on the surface seems to be everything right, a respectable job, raising a family, predictable routine, In every sense, it seems like they are winning at life. He is just what a man ought to be. But their very success comes at a cost. They have adjusted to the world so completely that they have lost touch with themselves entirely. To Kierkegaard, that person has slipped into finitude, completely surrendering to their limitations and becoming desperately narrow-minded, unable to see beyond their own nose, incapable of tapping into imagining a different way of being. They are in despair of finitude. They find it too dangerous to venture, for one may lose. This man does not dare to believe in himself, finds it too venturesome a thing to be himself, far easier and safer to be like the others, to become an imitation, a number, a cipher in the crowd. What makes this despair particularly dangerous is that it doesn't even feel like despair. Such a person even may be praised by men, honored and esteemed. There is no apparent suffering, no crisis, no nothing, only comfort. But comfort, in Kierkegaard's view, is often the most dangerous disguise for despair. Because when you stop reaching beyond what is, when you settle entirely into the finite, you stop becoming an integrated self. Beyond your worldly acquisitions, you have no self. But the opposite is no less destructive. We all know that one person who has drifted too much into the infinite, into possibility, imagination, or even the abstraction of knowledge, lost in fantasies, dreaming up a life they are too busy fantasizing about to actually take a step towards. They have become completely unrooted from reality. Their ideas of what might be expand so endlessly that the concrete self begins to dissolve. Kierkegaard paints a striking picture of this condition through what he calls the fantastical man. This is the person whose imagination has carried them so far into the infinite that they've drifted away from themselves entirely, completely failing to submit to the grounding constraints of reality. He writes that such a person becomes in a way infinitized, but not in such a way that he becomes more and more himself, for he loses himself more and more. The fantastical man is always chasing abstraction, forever swimming in the realm of someday and somehow. This is the despair of infinitude, the person who loses themselves in dreams and ideals and cannot return to the world as it is. Because for the self to exist, it must take form within limitations. In whatever way the balance between finitude and infinitude collapses, the end result is the same. The person, knowingly or unknowingly, falls into despair. And despair isn't just a mere emotion or a lingering, disturbing feeling. To Kierkegaard, it is a condition seated deep into the soul, what he calls the sickness unto death. It is not a sickness of which one could die. On the contrary, the torment is exactly that one cannot die from it. In the face of it, death tragically becomes the only hope that could save the despairer. Except that it's not even an option. Kierkegaard writes, "When death is the greatest danger, one hopes for life. But when one becomes acquainted with an even more dreadful danger, one hopes for death." So when the danger is so great that death has become one's hope, despair is the disconsolateness of not being able to die. For what could be worse than to live like a ghost, without a self, yet never able to escape the hollowness inside? And the tragedy about this sickness is that it's far more common than one would expect. In fact, the rarity is the person who isn't in despair. Kierkegaard thought that most people live and die without ever realizing that they were in despair at all, because this condition, for him, deepens with self-awareness. The more conscious the self becomes, the more acutely it feels its own misalignment. In other words, despair exists in degrees along a gradient of self-consciousness. The more self-aware a being is, the more deeply it can experience despair. A creature with little or no self-awareness cannot really despair at all, like an animal, for example. The types of despair: unconsciousness of having a self. The first kind of despair happens at the lowest level of self-awareness. It is both the most common and the most deceptive, because it feels like happiness. It's the despair of the person who doesn't even know that they have a self. Kierkegaard describes them as living entirely in the sensuous, guided entirely by life's pleasures and superficial rewards. They think they are happy, and if you suggest otherwise, they become furious at the mere thought. He writes they'd consider it an insult, something near to murder, in the sense that one speaks of killing joy. They've never looked inward or questioned who they are beneath the surface or what they want in life. He compares them to someone who lives in the cellar of their own house. The self has multiple floors, and they stay at the lowest level, satisfied with shadows and distractions, even though the upper floors are filled with light and beauty. And if you tell them that they are missing something, that there is more to life than what's in front of their eyes, they will not hear of it. To them, the very idea that they might be in despair feels like pure madness on your part. Despair over the earthly. The next kind of despair is what Kierkegaard calls despair over the earthly, and it marks the first awakening of self-awareness, though still faint and confused. Here, a person's identity is completely tied to external things: success, relationships, reputation, fortune. They've begun to sense that life can betray them, that all these things externally can change, yet they have no inner foundation to fall back on. When tragedy inevitably strikes, or when even good fortune becomes too much, they collapse entirely. Kierkegaard calls this immediacy, the state of living only through what happens to you, not what comes from within you. This kind of despair is passive. It isn't born out of rebellion or defiance, as we will see later, but out of dependence on the external. It's what happens when life delivers a blow the person isn't equipped to withstand. Their entire self of sense was borrowed from the world around them, so when those things suddenly change, the self receives a shock it cannot recover from. There is no inner anchor to steady them, because there was never a stable self to begin with. Crucially, it differs from the previous form of despair in that the unconscious man believes he's happy and never suspects despair. But this person has begun to feel it, even if ever so dimly, to sense that something deeper is missing. Yet instead of facing it, he clings harder to what's outside of him. He is in despair at not willing to be himself, Kierkegaard says, too frightened to let go of the external world and turn inward, too fearful of what he might find there. He would rather not be a self at all, or even in a lower sense, to be anyone but himself. He lives suspended between awareness and denial, conscious enough to suffer, but not yet courageous enough to change. Kierkegaard likens him to lower animals who know no other way of facing a threat but lying still and feigning death. But dead he is not. There is, if you will, life in the characterization. In case everything suddenly changes, everything in the outward circumstances, and the wish is fulfilled, then life enters into him again. Immediacy rises again, and he begins to live as fit as a fiddle. But this is the only way immediacy knows how to fight, the one thing it knows how to do, to despair and swoon. And yet it knows what despair is less than anything else. Despair over oneself. The next stage is far rarer and far lonelier. Here the person has turned inward. They've begun to see through the illusions of the external world, to realize that no amount of success or approval can silence the deeper unrest within them. But instead of finding peace in that awareness, it only makes them feel more estranged from themselves. This is what Kierkegaard calls the despair over the eternal, or despair over oneself, what he also names the despair of weakness. It's the moment when a person recognizes that the source of their suffering isn't something outside of them, but something within. They begin to see their own weakness, their inability to let go of what is earthly and finite, and instead of turning towards something that grounds them, like faith for Kierkegaard, or in a broader sense, reconcile with something bigger than themselves, like meaning or purpose or love, they turn inward upon themselves in torment. Kierkegaard describes it as a man who sits as it were behind a locked door, watching himself, aware of his own fragility but unable to move beyond it. He knows he's in despair, but he despairs precisely because he knows it. His self-consciousness has deepened, but so has his self-contempt. This is the kind of person who can no longer take refuge in distractions. He's introverted, perhaps even withdrawn, but his solitude is both the air he breathes and the prison he cannot escape. He cannot bear the thought of his weakness, and so he despairs over his own despair. He hates himself as a father disinherits a son, as Kierkegaard describes this state of self-alienation, where one part of the self rejects the other entirely. And beneath that introversion and solitude lies a kind of pride, for he cannot endure the thought of being weak, because he secretly wants to be strong enough not to need humility. In a moment of rationality, he might understand if you tell him that he must overcome himself to become himself, but would soon dismiss it as irrelevant once he's possessed by his thoughts again. If one were to talk to him thus, he would perhaps understand it in a dispassionate moment, but soon passion would again see falsely, and so again he takes the wrong turn into despair. And yet, to Kierkegaard, even this painful awareness is progress, because while the despair has deepened, and so did consciousness, the person now is standing closer to the truth than ever before. They have seen through the world's illusions. They just haven't yet found the strength to reconcile the different parts within them. They are still unwilling to be themselves. Now, from here, the despairing person who chooses to remain in despair can go on one of either two paths. Either the person breaks outward into distractions, or the despair potentiates into a higher, darker form, defiance. Despair at willing to be oneself. This is the final and most intense form of despair, what Kierkegaard calls the despair of defiance, or the despair of willing to be oneself. Here the self becomes aware why it refuses to be itself, for it to be itself, it would have to depend on something beyond it, something bigger than itself. To Kierkegaard, that would mean to bow before the power that created it, and in a broader sense, anything that humbles it and exposes it to the inevitability of needing from the outside. So it rebels fiercely in defiance, and it declares, I shall not need anyone other than myself, even if I had to suffer for all eternity in anguish. If in the earlier forms of despair, the person could not bear to face their weakness, here they are consumed by the illusion of strength. They no longer wish to be helped or to be dependent on anything outside themselves. They reject the limitations that make human existence bearable or even possible, like time, dependence, uncertainty, lack of control. They believe that they can be entirely self-made and self-sufficient. But when this despair intensifies, it takes on what Kierkegaard calls the demonic form, when the self no longer merely rebels, but becomes possessed by its own rebellion. Suffering becomes its identity. It clings to it as if it were the last thing truly its own. It would rather burn in its pain than be freed from it, for to lose the pain would feel like losing itself. Such a person would insistently put on an exterior of calmness and indifference to set the outward appearance at the level of indifference, to make it as unrevealing and indifferent as possible, while inwardly locking itself in a world for itself, closing all else out. Kierkegaard illustrates this in an evocative image. It is as if an author were to make a slip of the pen, and that this clerical error became conscious of being such. Perhaps it was no error, but in a far higher sense was an essential constituent in the whole exposition. It is then as if this clerical error would revolt against the author, out of hatred for him, were to forbid him to correct it, and were to say, "No, I will not be erased. I will stand as a witness against thee, that thou art a very poor writer." The typo is perhaps the individual who realizes, I didn't write this script, I didn't choose to be fragile or finite, and out of wounded pride rebels against it. In all the forms of despair we have discussed so far, the unifying factor is that despair is never caused by external events. It's always an inner imbalance in the self. And the more you try to fix your despair by rearranging your life, whether it's the job change, the relationship, the house, the city, the more despair you create, The cure is never in changing your circumstances, but in changing your relationship with yourself. Kierkegaard understood the human condition with probing depth that almost feels prophetic. Even today, modern psychology echoes many of his insights. I'm reminded of attachment theory, for instance, which describes how some of us lose ourselves in anxious attachment to others, while others hide behind fierce independence and dismiss other people when they try to get close. The anxious attacher maps to Kierkegaard's despair at refusing to be oneself. It is the person who grounds their sense of worth entirely in something external: love, approval, attention, validation. Their selfhood depends entirely on the other's responsiveness. When connection wavers, they panic. When they are chosen, they feel temporarily whole again. But their despair is exactly this dependency and their lack of an inner anchor. Kierkegaard's despair of defiance probably closely matches the avoidant attacher. This is the person who has swung to the opposite end and sworn their allegiance to none but themselves. They have learned to equate dependence with weakness and so resolve never to need anyone again. Both are ways the self tries to escape itself, and both end in imbalance. The only way out, in Kierkegaard's language or in psychologies, is the same: to be grounded in yourself, yet to remain open to connection beyond yourself. What we now call achieving a state of interdependence. A century before psychiatry had the language for it, he diagnosed what modern therapists would later recognize as forms of alienation and psychosis, which describe various states where the self becomes divided from itself, lost in either boundless fantasy or suffocating immediacy. His sickness unto death was, in this sense, the world's first psychological portrait of a divided self, and perhaps still the most accurate. Some have used his insights to critique modern-day practices, where psychosis is often treated as an intrusion upon the self from the outside, rather than something that carries its own meaning and presents a manifestation of a deeper misalignment within the self. Kierkegaard wrote, "To will to be that self which one truly is indeed the opposite of despair." He invites us to accept being the self that actually exists, finite, dependent, limited, yet free. To become oneself means freely choosing what is given, making your given life your own. The last thing I should say is that I have hardly touched the tip of the iceberg in this video. Kierkegaard's rich, layered insights could hardly be captured in any form unless you read them yourself. Also worth noting is that he was a theologian as well, and many of his insights are grounded in theology. In this video, I have kept it largely secular and did not touch on his interpretation of despair in relation to sin. If you are interested in Kierkegaard's critique of modern life and why we feel increasingly unhappy, you might enjoy this next video.